Welcome back to Flashpoint. The North Carolina General Assembly pushing forward with legislation that would give families more access to private schools. But teachers worry pumping all this extra money into a voucher system will only hurt already underfunded public schools. Joining us now on Flashpoint, Justin Parmenter. He's a CMS teacher and public school advocate. Justin, welcome back to Flashpoint. We appreciate it.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Listen, supporters of school choice say fund students and not systems. And when you hear that saying, I mean, it's kind of catchy, but for you, why, in your view, is it misguided?
Yeah, I think it is. You know, unfortunately, I think when we have this conversation about school choice and freedom, I think that the intent is to use emotionally charged language because this is America and we're supposed to be all about freedom all the time. But when your choices have a negative impact on the education that others are receiving, it's not just about your own personal choice. And so I think this approach is depleting resources that we really need in our traditional public schools. And I think we need to be able to have an honest conversation about it without resorting to emotionally charged language.
Advocates of this new sort of reform in Raleigh will say that this does not necessarily mean that resources are not going to be headed to public schools. Instead, that this can be a both and not an either or. What do you say to them?
Well, I think it's absurd to say that this is not money that was going to go to public schools anyway. I mean, we're talking about sending $500 million a year to primarily to private schools, and the General Assembly can use that money for anything they want to use it for. So I think that money should be going to our traditional public schools where those resources are really needed.
Let me ask you this. If a public school is struggling to bring up test scores and maybe it has some issues with violence, why shouldn't parents have the option of putting their kids in a school that has better options?
Well, I mean, I think it is good for students to have options. Families deserve options. Here in Mecklenburg County, we've got a fantastic magnet system in Charlotte-Mecklenburg schools that I think should be the model that we follow. You know, our traditional public schools do a whole lot better job at accepting students, at honoring who they are, and you know, if we can take the public school approach that doesn't discriminate against children, that respects them for who they are, and also provides them with some options that are good for them, I think that would be the ideal approach. But of course, to do that in the traditional public school setting requires resources. And when we're taking those resources and sending them somewhere else, then we aren't able to provide those sort of options to families within the traditional public school system that our society is built on. And
you make the case that I know that you are now diverting resources to private institutions that are often religious institutions and often don't exactly reflect the diversity of our communities, and in some cases will discriminate against some students.
That's right. Yeah. You know, our Constitution in North Carolina says no person shall be subject to discrimination by the state because of religion. And so to use state funding for an education that requires students to have specific religious beliefs, to me, I mean, I'm a teacher and not a lawyer or a judge, but that seems like a violation of that section of the Constitution. You know, many of these religious schools who take voucher money don't admit students who are gay, or, you know, explicitly say in their handbooks that being gay is grounds for expulsion. Fayetteville Christian School got $1.3 million this year, and they stand to get a whole lot more if this new legislation passes. Their handbook says they will not admit Mormons, Jehovah's Witnesses, Muslims, Jews, and other religions. And they also say that homosexuals are deviant and perverted and can't attend either. Now, personally, as a human and a taxpayer, I have a huge ethical problem with my public tax dollars being given to institutions who are legally able to discriminate in this way. And that's not how public schools treat kids. And I don't think we should be using our public dollars to support those kind of organizations.
What do you say to folks who say that pouring more money into public schooling is not necessarily going to have the outcomes that someone like you would want? Joel Ford, we had on the program, he pointed out Project Lift here in Charlotte as an example of millions of spent that really didn't have the intended consequences that folks wanted. What would you say to those people?
What I would say to those people is, how do you know that putting all this money into vouchers and sending kids to private schools is going to result in the academic outcomes that we're after? I mean, in North Carolina, we have the least regulated and least accountable voucher system in the entire country. We have no requirements in terms of accreditation. We have no requirements in terms of having licensed teachers, regulation of curriculum, no state testing requirements. So we have, we're talking about spending billions of dollars on a system that we have no way of knowing if we're getting a good return on investment. So I would just turn that question around and say, fine, you don't think that spending more money on traditional public schools is going to get us to where we want to go? How do we know that? It's because we're measuring those outcomes. But in these voucher schools, we're not. So I think taxpayers deserve a little bit more accountability than that.
What's your concern, not just in the next year or next 5 years, but your concern 20 years down the road about what this will do to education in North Carolina?
I think what we're seeing is a slow move toward the complete destruction of the traditional public school in North Carolina. And, I'm not sure if that's the intent, but in practice, that's what's happening, because we are slowly starving our traditional public schools as we create more and more choice in under the guise of celebrating freedom and giving people what they want. What we're doing is we're diluting the quality of the educational opportunities that are available to our children. And we're going to keep doing that until we get to the point where nobody is getting a good outcome. And I don't think that's where we want to go.
All right, Justin Parmenter joining us from Ocracoke, we should say, this morning. Justin, thanks for coming on Flashpoint again. We appreciate it.
All right. Thank you so much.
All right, take care. More Flashpoint after this.